We left it last time in the section that is called D, and it's called Development of the Total Personality, and I think I talked to you a little bit about this when we went to the profile. At the beginning, in very general terms. What is important in this section is the following. See what it says, development of the total personality. So far, we have been isolated. Drive development, the aggression, the defenses, the ego, the superego, and of course we are trying to relate all of these things together. Now we want, because we have covered all of that, we want to see this in action. And the way you see it in action is by looking at the specific situations that create stressful problems for individuals that have to be dealt with. What do I mean? And this applies to children, to adolescents, and to adults. It applies to anybody. For a child, what would you look at? Well, you look at the entry into a nursery school, for example. How did they react to that? What resources they could display, assuming that it was done reasonably intelligently at the right age and things of that kind. Obviously, you try to put a child in a nursery school at 2 years of age, he's going to have trouble. He's not ready to separate at that particular point in time. And so that has to be assessed, and you have to know that he by then has acquired the capacity to separate from the primary object for a certain amount of time every day. Not indefinitely, not for very long times. And we know all of that. We have a lot of information about this. We have run in the past nursery schools, and as I told you, we wanted to run one here because you learn so much, but you know what the difficulties are. But we may get there one day. In any case, that's a possibility. You look at the birth of a sibling, for example, or you look at an entry into the elementary school, or you look at the child being sent to camp at a certain age, or you look at critical situations, maybe hospitalization, maybe surgery, and you then can see the total personality in action. You know, all the resources are called into action to deal with that problem, and what they tell you about how the child copes with all of these things, or the adolescence or the adult, is very meaningful, and it gives you a very good feeling for how are the resources used, how many resources can be brought to bear in the situation that you're trying to deal with, and things of that kind. The same is true of adults. You look at an adult that was fired from his job. A lot of people have been fired recently in this country, and you see how he reacts and what happens, what resources he has, what does he do with it? Does he just become depressed and sulks, or does he go forward and start to plan his life anew and see what else he can do, and what else he can go and apply and see? You can look at how an adult reacts to a birth of a child, you know, or to a significant illness, or a hospitalization or surgery, loss of a friend, things of that kind. And all you do is simply tell them what happened. You know, say somebody that got divorced, which is a common phenomenon in this country. You ask them a little bit about what happened and how did that happen, and they will tell you how they feel. Frequently they come to you because they are feeling very bad about it, or depressed, or angry, or a combination of affects that are very disturbing and very upsetting to people. Other times you see what is a reasonable response, you know, with an initial, perhaps, state of confusion and even devastation within limits, but a very quickly recovery by calling the ego resources and really handling this in a variety of different ways. So that is what you try to do. You try to see the whole personality in action. And you select critical incidents, which they will tell you about, and they know one that has not, lost a job, or has a child, or has a sick child, or have been sick himself, or have been, there are all kinds of critical events that you can take a look at any given age. And that gives you a very good feeling for how the total personality responds to a critical incident. Okay? Now, there, Anna Freud was talking as well. That's where the lines of development come into play. But remember what I told you when we first introduced this idea. I wanted you to read them. I hope you have done that, because it gives you a very good idea that practically anything that is achieved in development has a long line and stages that one goes through at different points in your development and in different phases and at different ages, depending on some external events and things of that kind. But they can be mapped quite precisely, and she did that with a few lines of development. The hope was that many more will be developed in good time. But unfortunately, that hope never did materialize for a number of reasons. One of it is it's difficult to do it. You need somebody with Freud talents and experience to be able to map this thing. And two, the team that was doing this kind of got dissolved because some people died and other people like me left. And so it became an orphan kind of project. And nobody seemed to have taken it on. But it's a very good idea, and it gives you a feeling for what you had in mind, yeah? Now, here we give you a few examples as well of what may be like critical incidents that you want to see. Separation from the mother, for example, because the mother has to be hospitalized or goes on a vacation or whatever it is. Birth of the sibling, as I told you. Illness, surgical intervention, hospitalization, entry into nursery school entry. The change from the triangular Oedipal situation at home up to the age of 5 into a community of peers during the latency stage, and a similar phenomena during the adolescent stage as the child struggles to separate from his primary object and become independent. And there are significant differences. Obviously, the latency child moves into a community of peers, but his primary objects are still fundamental and still primary. When the chips are on the floor and have to be counted, is the family that is important to that child. You say, oh, I go with my 7-year-old friend and my neighbor. They want to go home, Now, with adolescents, it's different. They do the same, they are struggling with the same problem, and that is trying to move from the primary objects to become independent human beings. And they too move into a community of peers. But then the peers acquire a significance that is enormous, because they can compete with the parents and take the place of the parents. And so the ideas of the group that they join will beat the idea of the home where they grew, at least temporarily. And in some cases, and depending who they join, that may be a devastating experience. They may have chosen very bad company, and that can create a lot of problems. So now the latency children do the same. Not only join a community of peers, they start to look at other adults and start to make comparisons between these other adults and the parents. And the child goes from, oh, my dad is the strongest man in the world, or whatever it is, that your family is the best there is, and he knows it's true because his daddy told him, you know, that's what his daddy said. But then they go to school, and maybe they come home, and when the father or the mother says something, they say, that's not true, my teacher says. That was unheard of before. They were gods. Now the God state is being reduced to the right proportion, and they have been measured very carefully against other parents and against teachers and other people that start to populate the world. Nevertheless, particularly in early latency, the primary family is the dominant factor. With adolescents, that has changed. They move away from the family in the attempt at becoming independent, sometimes in very dramatic ways and in very traumatic ways for the parents. With luck, they come back in time with the ability by them to have become somewhat independent of the primary object. We have problems with that in our culture because education makes adolescents dependent well into young adulthood from the parents frequently. Because they pay their tuition, they have to help them with this, that, and the other, and so on. While in the past, by 16, 17, 18, when, as we were saying last time, people wasn't going to college or to university in the numbers that it happens today, but they got married, started to work, and went on with their lives, then they could become independent a lot earlier. Nowadays, we foster with some of our cultural morals, which are good and necessary, like education, but we foster the dependence for enormous periods of time. And there are people that are in their middle 20s that are still depending on the parents and have not achieved the ability to become independent because they can do it. You know. So you take all of this into account, obviously. Yeah? So now she says the step from play to work, she discussed that a little bit in one of the lines of development. And it gives you, I think, a pretty good idea of what the assessment of the total personality is trying to do and where the critical incidents are, that if you hear about them, you explore a little bit to get a feeling for that, okay? And then you go to the assessments of fixation points and of regression. And here I'm going to spend a significant amount of time because I think this is one of the most important points in the assessment of an individual, whatever age. Why? Because the personality gets organized around your fixation points. It's forced to. That is an anchor. It's like a boat. Once it drops the anchor in there, it can move so far and not very far away from that place. And the mechanism of symptom formation will be related to the stage where you are fixated. The defenses that you use will be related to it. The solutions that you look for have some of these characteristics. The fantasies that you have are determined by where you are fixated, and they will have, you know, whether it is the oral stage or the inner stage or the polycritical stage, your fantasies will be characterized. If it is the fixation at the oral stage, by oral concerns, or oral symptom formation, or behaviors that imply a lot of orality, or eating, smoking, chain smoking, chewing gum, doing all kind of strange things with your mouth. your interest, your ego interest, will be as well determined by your fixation point. They will limit what kind of interest you can develop. So, as you will imagine, if all of this is true, and it is, it not only does that, let me add a few more things, but we will go into it with a little more detail. It determines the quality of your object relationships as well. How you are going to relate to your objects and your expectations of your objects are. And so as you see, that really shapes you up pretty good. It defines who you are, essentially. And that's why I think it is so important. You can gather so much information, which then is valuable in the treatment of these patients. You have good signposts as to where the problems are, what you have to do, how you have to address them, what is essential for a good therapeutic success with these patients. And obviously you have to weigh that in the balance with the resources that the patient has. I hope you include the skills that you have, because in order to move people from certain points when they are fixated, when they are significant, or the result of traumatic situations, or they have precarious ego resources to deal with this, one can do an enormous amount of damage and create an enormous amount of suffering, and even make the life of the patient worse than it was originally. Remember what I told you earlier. Some patients have achieved the best solution that is possible for them. Just because we call ourselves therapists doesn't mean to say that we can improve them, and you need to have the ability to recognize that fact, and to recognize when you are in the presence of the patient that the best thing to do is do nothing. You become like an obstetrician that has a mother delivering. He doesn't touch her if she is delivering normally. We say that the best obstetrician is the one that does nothing. Okay? And that's true. He only intervenes if there is some danger that will not be overcome by the forces of nature themselves. At least that was the way it was when I was in medical school. Maybe that has changed and they do all kinds of things now. Now, obviously, there are other things that you have to take into account. It's not quite the same, and you need to know these things, to treat a patient who got arrested in a particular stage of development and never moved his drive organization past that point, that to treat somebody that went high to the phallic elliptical stage and then found massive conflicts there and was forced to regress. You see, that fellow was already there. He knows the way there. He was there once. He showed that whatever happened, he had the resources to move enough of himself there. Unfortunately, once there something happened that he had to go back. But he was once there. He knows the way there. And you as a therapist know that he can go back there because he was once there. And if you can find out what it is that pushed him back, then you can help. You remember that when we were talking of the phases of development, I made, well, I'm going to do this myself. This is the oral, anal, and phallic elliptical stage. Development starts here, yeah? And I told you it was like an elastic, right? When you develop a fixation here, then the elastic, you have to pull very hard to get it over here. But that elastic is under tension. In fact, if something happens here. Somebody slaps your hand and you let it go because of the way back to where the fixation point is established, right? And so, obviously, we are talking then of the difference between fixation and regressions. And how do you distinguish them? I'll be simplistic. I hope you read the paper, did you? So you will have become very familiar with this. If you didn't, I very strongly recommend you read it because it clarifies these things tremendously. And it gives you all the scenarios which I can give you, you know, in a talk like this. With arresting development, that is the fixation that is so massive that there is nothing left to move forward. Yeah? So what you will have is somebody that will have to organize his personality right there because he hasn't gone anywhere else. He has never been anywhere else. So that's what he has to do. That's a massive arresting development. They are very rare, but they do exist. And they create a lot of havoc. Most people don't have a massive arrest, which will in fact be very damaging to personality development, but they have different amounts of fixations, you know, at different points. And you remember that I gave you a metaphor of an army moving forward through hostile territory. And if they have to leave behind, you know, let's say in Georgia, before they move to Florida, a lot of the troops, when they get to Florida, they are very badly weakened. And if there is a lot of forces here opposing them, they may have to go back to Georgia. Why? Because 200 there and 200 from here is 400, and maybe they can defend a little a little better. You remember when we talk about this? Well, this is what we're talking about now. Now what happens? Let's say that you, for whatever reasons, and you remember that we said that fixation come about by two types of mechanisms. One is excessive frustration, and the other one is excessive gratification. Whatever it is, and whichever forms excessive frustration and gratification takes, a fixation, once it takes place, it depends on how massive the fixation is. Quantitatively speaking, how much of the troops have to stay in that province. Yeah? Now, let's say that it's not an awful lot, but enough, you left behind enough. Well, this is a child that maybe the mother will tell you, well, you know, it is really a problem, Dr. Nagera. This has happened to me millions of times. Because he's now 5.5. He still sucks his thumb. Never stop sucking his thumb. We put things in there that tasted badly, we punish him, we whatever. He is not even embarrassed of doing this in front of other people. Some children, where the fixation is not as important, they suck the thumb, but only in the presence of members of the family, people that they are very familiar with. Is somebody that is somebody they don't know, comes, they take the finger out, but they already have a callus developing here. Sometimes they have an ulcer in the damn finger. In any case, so what you see is that something that was normal up to 2, maybe even 2.5 years of age has continued as a symptom then through much later years, when it is no longer legitimate for a child to be sucking his thumb all of the time. That tells you that that child had a fixation that is obviously significant and that manifested itself in some behaviors and some symptoms all the way through to the point where you see that the child, if it is a child, if it is an adult, it's the same problem, you know. The only thing is that, and in that paper you would have read that fixations that are acceptable at a certain age, like talking you some, are not acceptable when you are 30 years old. It'd be very embarrassing to do that. You practically have to be psychotic to do that in front of other people. Though I have to tell you that I have known patients in their 20s that talk their thumb, only that they don't do it in front of you. So what happens? Children, as they grow older, move into adolescence and even in adulthood, find ways of moving the oral manifestation of the fixation into more socially acceptable behaviors. So, which in the particular group, for example, you may like gum and chew gum all the time, but you can live without gum. You're not sucking your thumb anymore, and that's more acceptable for a while. Okay. It's obviously for some people a not very acceptable mechanism, and some people feel quite disgusted by it. If it's done, you know, you get people getting it, put it somewhere in a paper, put it back in the mouth. And I have patients that come and put it somewhere, and they literally pick it up. That obviously is not as acceptable, but it's better than sucking the thumb, you know what I mean? Or they may become smokers, or it gets disguised into activities that are normal. We all have to eat. But then the eating has special characteristics. In other words, they may overeat and get to be overweight, or they become bulimic, or they only eat certain type of foods, or they have to have a certain type of flavor, or they have to smell in a certain way. And there are all kinds of variations. Or they smoke a pipe, or they smoke cigars, or whatever it may be. In other words, whatever the fixation is that was originally manifested by one of the component instincts, you remember the component instincts of the different phases, yeah? Is exchanged for things that become more appropriate for the age of the child. And then when they become adolescents, more appropriate for the adolescents. And when they are adults, they can hide it. Sometimes real well behind activities that are pretty normal, because we all have to eat. Only that if you look at how they eat, what food means to them, you say that's not normal. That is a problem that manifests clearly. Is evidence, clear evidence of the fixation that the person has. Okay? The same is true of any other type of component instinct from any other phase. Same is true. Same thing happens. Now, in other cases, there is another, that's a significant, massive fixation that is visible all the way through, right? Other times it's not as obvious. The mother said, well, he used to suck his thumb, but you know, at some point he gave it up. It wasn't easy, you know, but he gave it up, and then he only did it by himself, and if there was somebody that we didn't know, or a stranger in the house, he would do it. And then later he went to his room, and I think he still does it. He's now 8, but he doesn't do that in front of anybody. He's trying to control this. If there is then a regression back to here, what you will hear is the last few weeks he has gone back. He sucks his thumb all day long. Doesn't matter anymore who is there, how many times you tell him that that's disgusting or whatever it may be. You understand what I mean? The manifestation of it that was quiet and not too loud now suddenly explodes again, which means to the fixation that manifests itself all the time was added with the regressive movement an enormous increase on the activity of the component instincts related to that stage of development. So that's the way you can distinguish. In the one case, it has been present all the time, more or less in a uniform manner. It may have changed the form of expression to forms that are more acceptable. In the case of a regression, what you see is an increase of that activity that really gets out of control. You know? In other words, to the manifestation that you could observe all through the history of this patient, all of a sudden you see a recrudescence of this manifestation, or some new oral things that come to the fore with a bang, and it's very surprising. Okay? Now, obviously, all of these things have diagnostic value and has prognostic value. The more primitive the fixation, the more compromised the personality development is. Right? So that if you massive fixation is at the oral level, you really probably are quite handicapped if it is really very massive. While if it is at the end here, most of the foundation of development has gone well up to the phallic-idipal phase. And so, much of your ego structure, much of the defense mechanism that you develop, much of the resources that you have in terms of drive that you have to move forward to become normal have done that, rather than remain arrested. And the drive contributes to ego development. If you have a massive fixation, your ego development is being damaged because it's restricted by the fixation in a large number of different ways. All right. Now, obviously, when we are talking of fixation here and referring to drive development and so on, the same is true of the aggressive drive. It applies exactly the same way. And it will show in exactly the same way. You have a child with an anal sadistic fixation, and it will show. He is an anal sadistic character. It will show in his character, in his interest, in his behavior, in his ego interest, and you will see that there is a lot of analysis involved in his hobbies, his interests, what he reads, the way he talks, the expressions that he used, the jokes that he made, are full of anal content, And maybe he goes into toilet and writes poems in there of a certain type. People do all kind of very strange things with these things. So, does it show only that? No, it shows in many other ways. It shows in the quality of the object relationships. Why? Because if they have a fixation to the anal sadistic stage, the only way they can relate to their objects is in an anal sadistic manner. And so the quality of their object relationship will be tainted by these things. And it is from that group that you get a lot of spouse abusers, and you get a lot of elderly abusers and things of that kind. Why? Because their aggression is fixated at that stage. It's an anal sadistic type of organization, and when they explode with violence and in a very aggressive manner. And as you remember, they have never, because they retain so much behind the Oedipal phase, they have never fused libido and aggression in such a way that it will tame the aggression. You remember when we talked of the move from the anal stage to the phallic upper phase, that it typically aggression and libido fuse, and then it becomes tame, and the child then, from being a child that if you fall, he's fighting, he kicks and really tries to hurt you. He learns that no, that's not the way you fight with rules. You don't hit anybody in the floor, you don't hit in the back, it becomes a gentleman kind of aggression, but you tell that to somebody who has not fused his aggression with libido and has not moved to the higher phase, and you're wasting your time because he doesn't know what you're talking about. He can do it. His aggression is felt with an incredible amount of violence. So as you see, it will show not only in his behavior, in his ego interest, but in his relationship to his objects as well. And so it's very simple. In reality, when you listen to the patient and the history that he's giving you, you don't even have to ask too many questions. He's telling you, you just have to have the ear to hear. There are people that listen to a symphony and don't know what the violins are. They have not developed the skill to differentiate between violins and flutes, or violins and violas, or violas and cellos. It requires training. Otherwise, what you hear is noise. You say, sounds good, pretty. You like it? Yeah, I do. But if you check the trick, they have no idea of what the interplay was between the instrument and the orchestra that make that symphony beautiful and really well structured and well conceived. Why? Because they are not trained to hear, And so, are they deaf? No. They hear music and they have likes and dislikes. Do they know a damn thing about what the orchestra is doing? No. And that's true of therapists as well. They hear noises. But if you don't develop this knowledge and these skills, you really cannot distinguish between the violins and the viola. And you don't know. Music is like anything else. And as you know, they say this is a symphony in C major, or in D minor, or whatever it is, And you think that just means that it has so many, I don't know what the word is in English, for increasing half a tone the pitch, or diminishing it. In Spanish is, who knows music here?
Sharps and flats. It's
Flats.
Sharps and flats.
Sharps and flats. The sharps you increase half a tone, the flat you go down half a tone. If you're in a piano, you a different key. You play a string instrument, you think it goes down, and you learn to do that. Well, as I was telling you, the D major or E minor and so on, means that, there are so many flats and so many sharps in it. But the fact is that composers and people that knows music and know the structure of music knows that certain keys, which is what this is called, D major key, or C major key, or C minor, or C augmented, whatever it may be, they know that that combination has a particular effect in people. And it may be one that is joyful or is one that is very sad. And a good composer never uses a kid if he's trying to express sadness that conveys joy, because he knows that key can be used. You understand what I mean? You know why he does that? Because he knows what he's doing. He's a composer, for God's sake. That's why he can write music. Well, here we are composers in a different sense as well. And the more you know about these things, the better off, the more you will enjoy what you do, incidentally, because there is an enormous amount of pleasure in listening to music with understanding, just as there is an enormous amount of pleasure of listening to patients with understanding. And there is an enormous amount of pleasure too when you know that you didn't quite get it, but you know you will get it if you hear it again. Now, some people has a talent in an incredible degree, yeah? And other people doesn't have much talent. And talent you can buy anywhere. Either you have it or you don't have it. You have some you can develop further. You have none, then hope for you. And that's the truth. And there are differences. Just to use a metaphor. Again, in music, I don't know, I'm music today for some reason. You think of Mozart. Mozart will hear a whole damn symphony and could write it down in memory. He would sit down and write it. And one of the most frightening things that he did for his father, who was a musician, was that once he went to the Vatican, where only in Easter they play something called the Miserere, which is a beautiful piece of music that was secret to the Vatican, jealously guarded, never published. Only the church had it. Only the Pope had access to it. And they played it in the Vatican at Easter time. There was Mozart with his father. And his father then wrote to his mother. He used an endearing term, which I don't remember what it was, but essentially saying Mozart had done something terrible. He copied the Miserere as soon as it was finished and has sent it to a publisher. And the Miserere now is public knowledge because Mozart copied. If nobody knew that he did it, because nobody could think that he had that kind of facility for music, right? So he was never suspected. Had he been suspected, they would have excommunicated him right there and then, because that was sacred music, only played one day during Easter. So you may not be Mozart, that you have to be born that way, and there are few people born like that. But you may be born, like most of us, with enough skills that can be developed. All right? And not to develop them is criminal to yourself and to your patient. It's not as much fun, you know, to be listening to things that you don't understand and cannot make sense of. It's like music. And that's, in a way, is what psychotherapy is. It's like music. Either you understand it or you don't. All right. Now, I know some of you have to go, what, at 6? Mm-hmm. All right. And then that's the right time to finish it, yeah? Let me move on. Now, when you talk about fixation, you can say, and people, again, depending on the level of the skills, will say, oh, he's fixated to the anal stage. And that's okay, you are making a good statement if you have the data to show that he's fixated to the anal stage. But if that's all you say, you are being a very poor musician. You really have to listen more carefully and say, yeah, that's the anal stage, all right, by saying in music. That's the cadenza that is being played by the flute only. And here you have to do the same. You say, yeah, it's the anal stage, but it's such and such component instinct that is really at the basis of this fixation. And that is extraordinarily important, because psychoanalysis and human conflicts are based on the idea that some of our drive get into trouble with the environment, with the culture, and they have to be repressed. In other words, psychoanalysis is a theory of conflicts. And if you are going to help that patient and you are stuck at the anal sadistic stage, you can go past to where really the conflict is behind that facade of the anal sadistic stage, and that is whatever component instinct is the one that is really involved in the fixation. And if you don't know that, you never get to it, you can never interpret the conflict, you can never find where it came from, why it became a conflict, why he's using these defenses against that thing. You stay in the outside of the tree, you don't know the tree. You understand what I mean? Now, it's better to say, yeah, it's a tree, than to say that's a cow when it's something with leaves and so on. But then you have to go in there and take a leaf and say, yeah, this is a leaf is of this type and it has so many lobes and I can see, you know, that whatever it is that you can describe about it. So it is important to not only say that it's fixated at the oral stage, but then say, what in the oral stage? Is it sucking? Is it biting? You know, is it licking? What is it? And the fantasies are in swallowing. The fantasies are ad infinitum. Now, you look at the object relationships, as I told you, because sometimes that's the only place where you see it. In other words, the patient shows the fixation point only in terms of his ability to relate to objects, in the quality of his relationship. His aura is probably, as I told you earlier, clinging, demanding, feel hopeless and helpless, doesn't think he can do it, he wants to be fed. He feels like an infant does during the oral stage. He has no resources, only that this is now a 30-year-old man or woman, quite capable, possibly very intelligent, that still is feeling as if he was a 9-month-old baby or 15 months old. You know, so you look at the object relationship as well. Now, what do you look at? I told you already. Behavior, games that children play, they have meaning. Comics that they bring to you, the Hampshire Clinic, we had comics in the waiting room for kids. And they always came with comics, and some people say, oh, that's a resistance. And sometimes it is, but frequently it's a means of communication. If you look at the comic, you say, by golly, he's describing his family. He's talking about his family. He's telling you, you know. So you open your eyes and your ears, and then you see and hear. Now, so his play, what kind of play he engaged in? Fantasy play, his attitudes, his ego interest, his fantasies whenever they are available. And children will frequently play act the fantasies. So you don't even have to ask, he's going to play act in front of you. With adolescents and adults, you may have to ask. You say, well, yeah, you say you masturbate, but what is the fantasy that you use? Or what is a typical fantasy that you use? And then they will tell you. And the content of that fantasy is strictly related to the fixation points. So it will have, what is a fantasy? Let's say that is somebody who is an oral person. Probably the fantasy involves oral sexual activities, fellatio, whatever it may be, you know, sucking teeth, whatever it is that this person has in his mind. And so it goes. So it goes with any one of them. Or the symptoms that the patient has. They usually tell you very clearly what the fixation is like. Now there are, and I should warn you about this, some temporary forms of regression, particularly in children, not so much in adults, but you can occasionally see it in adults as well, under very dramatic circumstances. But in children, regressions are easy. In fact, most young children regress in the evening when they feel sleepy. And they become cranky and cry easily and become difficult. You say, what the hell is going on? I'm just tired. And he's being regressive, and so he's becoming demanding and clinging. And the same is true if they get hurt, or if they are sick, or are in pain, or things of that kind. But the moment the pain disappears, or they fall asleep and wake up the next day, that behavior has disappeared. It's a temporary form of regression, very typical of children. Not so typical of adults, because we have more resources, but in very dramatic situations, adults can become regressive. We talk. The other day when we were discussing here mourning and losses, for some situation of that type where the patient becomes so regressive that it's unbelievable. Sometimes, in fact, they develop what is a wishful hysterical psychosis. All right. We talk about the difference between fixation and regression. How the fixation you can identify, because past the stage where that activity of that component instinct was normal, past that stage you still see that activity. So you said it has been fixated, that phase, and within that phase, if it is sucking in some, you know what it is, that's oral sucking. Or what if it is biting or spit, you know, whatever it may be. And the regression is something that comes later on. And this minor sotto voce manifestations of the fixation all through development suddenly become like a loud groups of 20 sopranos, you know, singing in a very loud voice. And that's the difference. Why? Because the libido and the aggression came back to that phase and now have reinforced the activities of that phase. Now, that's interesting, because as you will imagine, when you are 7 or 8 or 9, your ego has developed tremendously and has acquired superego and a lot of attitudes in terms of how do you deal with certain impulses, particularly anal, sadistic, aggressive impulses, but not only. And so when the child regresses massively to such a phase and starts to behave in such a manner, he can help that, and the family will be horrified. But a part of him is as horrified as the family is. He can help it. He will continue to behave that way. But now his ego has a horror of these impulses, which he didn't have when he was going through the phase, because that's normal for the phase. And your cognitive development is not opposing any of that. Once you go higher up and you say, you don't shit in your pants, you know, that's only babies do that, and you are doing that, there is a part of you, you have to accept it. You know, it's like a toothache. What are you going to do? It's there, you go to the dentist and try to remove it. It is there, so you can say to the pain, go away. He can say to his soiling, go away. And will probably then develop alternative defenses to ignore it, deny it, repress it, you know, do whatever he can with it because he's very embarrassed. But a part of him will be horrified of the fact that he's now behaving in this gross manner to which he already has enormous objections in his own introjects, in his superego. You understand what I'm saying? So that complicates the life of these children tremendously. Okay, see what else is worth telling you about this. Oh, yeah, it is important when you are told, well, 6 months ago, he developed all this again, and he's doing all, he's soiling again, he had been clean and dry for so many years, and now look, there it is, we don't know what to do. And he says, family will say he's not embarrassed even about it, which may be true, but frequently it's not, because then they tell you that he's hiding it, or trying to hide it, which means there is a part of him that obviously is not happy with what is happening, but what is he going to do, you know? And but what is important then is to look carefully at what was it that was happening around that time that may have induced that regression. And that may be environmental factors, unfavorable environmental circumstances. That it's like when the elastic goes all the way to here, something happens here, that it slaps your hand and it comes back all the way. And it may be the divorce in the family, fights between the parents, the birth of a sibling, God knows what. Something obviously induced a regression, and it's important to know what it is, when it took place. Sometimes it's in the environment. Sometimes it's a developmental conflict. In other words, it's internal. No factor on the outside world that can explain it, but the developmental conflict that the child was going through might explain why he took the regressive move, took the leap. Now, I have to tell you that we assume as analysts that there are occasions where even people that doesn't have established fixation will regress very badly. And that's true. That's what happens in very traumatic situations. It happened in concentration camps where people knew that they were going to be gassed and die and were starving to death and becoming caquettes. Some of these people became extraordinarily regressed. And that is not abnormal. I already told you that all of these fixations change the facade as you grow. You try to become adapted to what is acceptable, otherwise you get embarrassed constantly, you know, by the people in the environment pointing out to what you're doing and things of that kind. So you try to hide it. With some people there is a very interesting way of hiding it. It goes into the sexual life, where it becomes a secret that only he and his partner know about. You know? So it's never shown except in the sexual life. And so and that's an interesting situation, because many perversions or semi-perversions are of that type. You know, they are hidden behind the four pleasurable activities of couples and things of that kind. So it's important to keep your ear open to all of these things, because sometimes it is disguised pretty much in that way. Now, obviously, if you have a child in the phallic Oedipal phase, he has all kinds of phallic Oedipal fantasies and castration anxiety and nightmares and so on. He regresses. All of these fantasies disappear. The fantasies that come back to the foreground are the ones that are typical for that stage. In other words, he lost the high level of achievement, and the conflicts at the higher level are gone because his drive has gone backwards. And that is obviously important and significant, and you have to pay attention to them. So you don't observe any longer the fantasies and the anxieties and the conflicts that are typical of the phase that he has abandoned. That disappears, it's gone, because he moved backwards, so he's no longer there. Now, the other thing that happens with fixation is, I was telling you that they influence development, they influence everything. So take a child that is normal and didn't develop massive oral fixations or anal fixation, get here reasonably clean. He still will have the conflict of that phase, which is mostly, for a boy, a lot of castration anxiety, and they feel what will happen to, what is the difference between people, how did people lose it, and things of that kind. Same for girls. How come I don't have it, kind of thing. Well, if that child hasn't got an early fixation, his fear of, if he become, and he will become symptomatic, because that's a developmental conflict and he produces symptoms until it gets resolved. He will produce, let's say, phobias of knives or scissors, or he can go to the barber that will cut his hair. He goes into a panic if he goes to the barber because he cuts hair. And of course people say, oh, he's going to cut your ear and so on, and that's not very good. So the anxiety corresponds to that level. If it is somebody that has an oral fixation, but it's not a complete arrest, but he moves a lot of his libido to the phallic idipal phase, he will have the same castration anxiety. But now the fear is not that scissors are dangerous or knives are dangerous. The fear is that animals bite and can take your finger off or your hand off. It's rarely, if ever, referred to the sexual organs. But it's the expression of the anxiety is not at the higher level. See, a phallic boy is interested in knife and scissors, things that cut, that penetrate and do things like that. An oral boy doesn't have that interest. And of course the interest and the fear go together. Yeah, the knife becomes dangerous then. An oral fixated boy that moves enough libido to the phallic idipal stage will express his castration anxiety in oral terms. And that's how you can see that the fixation point influences the rest of development, and the form that the conflicts acquires in the higher level, they get kind of tainted by this. The stronger the fixation, the stronger that you will see the impact of that phase in the higher level of development. So that's something that you need to take a look at. Now, just to end, let me just tell you that some people get a fixation here or there, and that's it. They are orally fixated, anally fixated, phallic idipally fixated. Other people get fixations everywhere. Why that is the case is different for everybody, but it may be very conflictual home situations, whatever, very favorable developmental circumstances for the child that lead to fixations everywhere. Then what you see is a very mixed picture. And obviously that's not very good. To have fixations at every level is worse than to have one point where you are fixated, except if it is at a very primitive oral level, Generally speaking, most people have fixation in different places, which are not too excessive, because we go through all the phases, and it's very rare that we can traverse all this territory where there are conflicts without any signs of the conflicts. You understand what I mean? But it's a quantitative matter that is important. Some minor signs of fixation at different phases don't mean a damn thing. You're talking about thinking quantitatively. It has to be somewhat significant, and you have to see the influence of that in the rest of development, And I think that for the time being, that's about as much as we will do with fixation and regression for today. If you read it, I think you would have understood most of what I said without much difficulty. If you didn't, you should have. You still have a chance to read it, and it will perhaps make the reading a little easier.